Good afternoon, welcome back to our final series of sessions this afternoon, and I'm delighted that our starting point is going to be a fireside chat led by Mike Gilfix, who was up on stage earlier on, our Chief Product and Engineering Officer, and joined by Kimiya Minoukadeh, who is the Global Head of Quantitative Trading for ING. And I'm looking forward to this session because we're going to now try and land some of the discussions we've been having this afternoon about the evolution of AI and how it's impacting us, looking at it through the lens of a practitioner who's looking at how to take advantage of these new opportunities and make it real in their own environment. So without further ado, please welcome Kimiya and Mike to the stage.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time. I'm really excited for folks to hear your story. And you know, we were chatting before this, you were telling me about the transformation that ING had gone through as an organization that was both cutting edge as well as one where our partnership dates way back. So it'd be great if you could kind of frame the journey, you know, help folks understand what was the transformation, when did that emerge, and then when did our partnership start in all of that?
So I guess to set the context, I mean, I've been at the bank for about 5 years, and KX and the partnership, the journey started just before I joined. So again, I mean, it made sense because as a lead quant on the electronic FX side initially, I had to come in when the data was there, ready to work with. But the journey started, I would say, about maybe 7 years ago for ING. And it was at a good time because it was also sort of at the start of a big digitization push at ING. And what that meant was that it was became really inherent in the strategy of ING. It wasn't a purely sort of EFX decision or idea. We started primarily back then with FX data, fixed income data, but now it's very much embedded across financial markets. So as everybody talks about as well in the trading space, trying to kind of bring all the asset classes closer together, typically in systems that have been in place for many, many years. All of the different asset classes are, in different systems, different risk systems, and it's quite difficult when you want to get a holistic view, whether it's a risk view, for trading heads, it's quite hard, mostly because of the systems being so different, bringing it together. And so using KDB for us has been part of that journey of bringing the asset classes closer together. And compared to my previous experiences and the desk's previous experiences, I think at other banks, KDB was there purely almost as a sort of data storage solution, whereas at ING, it's been very much sort of embedded within, trading, risk, the quant space, even sales functions, which I guess we'll discuss.
Yeah, because as I understand, when it first was adopted, it was a quant tool.
Yes.
And then based on the success of it as a quant tool, it kind of permeated all these different areas of the organization and became almost a core part of the fabric of the way the organization works. Maybe you could share a little bit of how that worked.
Yeah, so naturally, again, a quant tool because it's sort of data that we're used to working with, whether it's in the Q language directly, which a lot of us, being at other banks who worked with KDB, were already quite comfortable with, and otherwise through Python. So I think it's natural, again, for backtesting, for analysis. It was always primarily as a quant tool. I think how it started to spread to other functions, I'll see if the slide shows up correctly, is actually thanks to, again, part of the partnership where we were one of the early adopters of KX dashboards as well. So we started to build sort of live trading monitoring, monitoring position, monitoring trading activity on the FX side, and this became hugely successful. So then you get sort of trading desks wanting to look at it, even risk functions would keep an eye on this, that every time there was something abnormal or unexpected, they would kind of reach out to us and see what's happening. So I would say, again, it's sort of showing the success in one space, and it started to spread there. And then whenever we had senior management as well at ING coming over to the desk, this was just incredible because not only this is just a screenshot, but we made it very interactive in terms of P&L drawdowns. If somebody comes to the desk, you just drill in and go, okay, this is exactly why it's happening. And it lets you make decisions based on that. So I would, again, maybe selfishly, because I started on the FX side last year, have more of a cross-asset mandate. But this, again, led by business. This is another sort of thing I want to kind of emphasize, I guess, is the success of data, AI, these sorts of tools, is we designed this, right? We know what's good to look at. And I think it was mentioned in previous panels as well, collaboration, communication. I think the fact that this was sort of led by business, not a completely separate team who's thinking of what tools may be possible, but we conceive this every time. We're like, what is the day-to-day stuff that we're doing? Let's bring it all into one screen. And so that was a trading use case. And then this is obviously, it's not KX dashboards, but it is, again, KDB data that's feeding another now sales analytics sort of vendor that we're working with, that the salespeople really look at for client flow analysis. So whereas the KX dashboards for us are more of a sort of trading use case, sales are looking at something else, which is 100% driven by the KDB data we have in place as well. So it's really spread across functions.
Yeah, one of the things I think that's most fun about my job is that I get to see how our KX technology changes the way that organizations work. You just gave some great examples of how just gaining that level of visibility was transformative for the business outcome. But rumor has it that some of your traders even went so far as to learn a bit about Q. So there must have been a very big shift in the way that they worked through their access to data. What was that like? What was that cultural change like? How did it change the way that people operated?
Yeah, I mean, that's funny. You say cultural change, and I see that as something that's almost, say, a message from above. But actually, I think it is down to tools like this, and I would say specifically KX dashboards, where you put it in front of traders and they see the value of it. And so again, you're answering certain questions that you find valuable, and I put it in front of you and you're like, well, I want to answer, I want to ask a slightly different question. So then when they know that they're, inches away from the raw data that they can query themselves, then it gives them the incentive. Because, we talk about also, we have Python training for traders, and you could have Q training for traders, but ultimately, if they don't see the purpose of it, and we sort of went the other way, this is what you can have, these are the kinds of questions you can answer, here it is in front of you, and then it makes that sort of, they start asking the questions. So I would say it was more a sort of bottom-up than a top-down journey or approach. But yeah, a number of our traders do query Q or the KDB database directly.
Good things can happen when you liberate your data, I suppose, and then let everybody get access to it. And now that you were able to establish a shared platform, that was, I think, you were telling me that's a big opportunity because there was one place to go to find the data, and everybody was working off a common shared understanding of the same data. Maybe you could, give us some color on that. What did that do when you brought everything together?
Well, I guess it just removes the barrier or lowers the barrier. It is one common language. For myself, for example, having moved into having a cross-asset mandate, if, for example, we didn't have the fixed income data, or speaking to, the equities group about getting their data in KDB as well, it would just be a lot harder to be able to move into different asset classes, to bring them together if it wasn't in the same sort of database. At least if you have a common language, the other details sort of can figure themselves out. And I think that's ultimately what it was for us, whereas if they were in completely different systems, that conversation would be a lot harder.
Now, you all were using different forms of AI as well, right, in the bank. I think one of those areas was looking at, the impact on things like pricing models, right, for the purpose of FX trading. What kind of stuff were you using? How did that work?
Yeah, so Luca mentioned it in the previous panel as well, but one of our first adoptions or implementations of AI was within FX pricing. And so in terms of the impact on the business, we went live with the model, which is a sort of simple reinforcement learning model. It really focuses on pricing and specifically looking at the context we're in to try to price or spread appropriately in volatile markets. Again, this past year has been very interesting, how crazy in the markets. You see the timeline here. Obviously, it was the US elections as well last year. You see general activity picking up, but we went live with the AI model just before that, and we have the sort of green and blue lines there are for the sort of larger ticket flow that we've seen on certain streams that we deployed this AI model to. And you see this sort of significant uptick in the big ticket sizes coming in, and that's sustained throughout the year, whereas the streams where we did not see or we did not make this change for reasons I'll leave out here, but you see that that's sort of flatline. So you see the real difference that it made, and for us it's because we put this model in place because it was really something where there's people talk about vol of vol being high. It's like things either are not moving, but when they move, they suddenly move a lot. So rather than having a fixed system or sort of pre-trained model in place, you had a human constantly tweaking parameters to try to stay competitive in different market conditions. And so this constant tweaking, again, is something that we took to sort of we'll automate into an AI model and go live with that.
Yeah, it seems like there's a really big difference between making a model work in a lab setting and then trusting essentially the heart of your business over to this model making decisions, even if humans are trying to tweak it and observe it on a regular basis. Any tips or processes that you use to make sure that you had trust in this system to go and deliver?
Yeah, it was interesting because I was listening in the other panel as well, just in terms of sort of experimentation versus, putting things into production. And there are different, as when we mention AI, there are so many different streams. Anywhere you mention an AI and people think necessarily Gen AI or LLMs, whereas in our algo trading space, we're talking about FX prices. So we're kind of within the numerical space. We're not necessarily talking about, analyzing free text in this space. Again, if we're talking about looking at news data, trading news data, perhaps we're talking about a slightly different model. But here, it's, we're just talking about sort of predicting pricing. And so in that sense, and not any sort of pricing, the FX market is quite liquid. You have, you have lit order books available, market data available. So when you have sort of reference points in pricing that you're about to send out, you can quite comfortably put limitations around it. And we have, very strong algo governance in place as well for models like this. So anything we're about to deploy in the algo trading space, any asset class, we have to make sure the controls are in place. We have circuit breakers. Certain or many boxes need to be checked to make sure that we're deploying it in a safe environment. I think where we're talking about sort of testing AI models, making sure that they're safe, the EU AI Act was mentioned as well. I mean, that's kind of different when we're talking about how we're using client data. We have to be extra careful on that. When we're thinking of making firm prices, for example, to clients, that's where there's no real sort of benchmark price, or we don't have tens of markets, where we can check that with. Whereas in certain markets, again, the credit market is becoming a lot more transparent as well, but within FX in particular, if you get the price wrong, again, you will never send a price that's too far away from market because all of those checks are there. But if the price is wrong, then it's maybe a small P&L hit on the trading desk. But yeah, certain asset classes make it a lot easier, and there's almost no excuse for it to go too wrong. And it's all about, as we have again, model validation to make sure any model you do go live with where you keep monitoring it and you make sure you have measures in place to say, okay, well, if these and these conditions are not met over a period of time, then it's time to revisit. But yeah, I'd say in a lot of liquid products, the impact can be seen quite quickly, and you have to be, just make sure you're on top of that. And we have kind of firm guidelines and policies in place to make sure we are.
Seems today also that everyone's talking about agents. It sounds like a good spy movie, but I think it's actually about some productivity and changing the way that you can operate. So what's the opportunity for agents at ING?
Again, I think, I'm here speaking from a quant trading point of view. We've talked about a lot of cases, whether it's for developers, whether it's for example, the previous slide as well, talking about looking at client flow or trying to make actions or decisions based on that. But ultimately, an agent is trying to define or achieve a certain goal by taking some actions, right? So I would argue even what we have within the FX space, it's an agentic model. You say this is the target you want to reach, or this is the goal that you want to optimize P&L. It's just that the list of, the tasks that it has is quite well defined. I think when we talk about in this room about agentic models, it's very much, it has, access to the full suite of tools, and it knows exactly where to go to take certain decisions. But again, in terms of experimentation, I think a sort of algo desk is actually a very nice, safe space to experiment with these sorts of models, because the space is quite defined, I say, and you have a lot of, very clear, I think, checks that you can have to make sure you're sort of pricing correctly, you're not trading, too aggressively into the market. So all of those things, the boundaries are set, and the agent kind of works within that. And then otherwise on the desk itself, I think there's lots of use cases, especially most obviously, I think, for developers in our space.
Yeah, I like that little nugget of, it's sort of like it's a frame of mind as much as it is a technology, meaning you could apply it, you see elements of that benefit applied to the system already.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually very good advice for different folks that are thinking about applying it. Switching gears a little bit, and I think it was actually in the graph that you had put up here, we talked a lot about volatility and how that impacted your business.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, your systems had to stay stable. They had to be up and running. They had to be bulletproof, right? To make sure you could capitalize on that volatility. Yeah. And so how did you go about doing that? What's the secret sauce?
The secret sauce. I mean, you do have to get the infrastructure right. And I would say over the years, the first few years of getting KDB implemented within the ING, e-trading workspace, it was mostly about growth. Like, let's get as much data as we can because we haven't had it. Let's get it all in. And there was maybe an oversight on how much we can handle, volatile market conditions. And so again, it's a normal journey, sort of focused on growth. And then in the past year or longer, it's been really about getting the stability right. So we noticed early on that when in busy sort of market conditions, we would see, again, it has nothing to do with sort of historical database or anything on disk, but the memory use for us was becoming, a bit of a challenge. And also the dashboarding. So, both in terms of the data and the dashboarding, everything would sort of get a bit fragile when markets were more volatile. But again, that's when we started to scale more horizontally, split processes, and almost overnight, that solved our stability issue. And I think that's something that we've handled really well. Thankfully, again, we had some examples of this, say, in the previous year, which meant by April, Liberation Day, where we heard a lot of peers have stability issues with their data, we were absolutely fine, and not a single, our most stable day, our most stable volatile day. So I think over the years, we'd really addressed the stability issues by scaling horizontally, by putting in solutions like more caching, for example, on the dashboarding side. We addressed all of those, and so this year it's been incredibly stable for us.
All right, so you've gone through the journey. You've gotten a lot of great outcomes from it, but hindsight 2020, or when KX is involved, it's like 2010. Really good vision. But what did you learn from that experience that you could share? If you had to go back, would you do some things differently? Is there some great wisdom that you could pass on from that?
I would, because a lot of us had already dealt with KDB for a long time. So you say it's been around for a while. I mean, I've been using it for over 10 years, maybe 15 now. So I personally think the main, and again, I had only used it sort of within the FX world where there's very structured and clean data. So what I've observed more in the other asset classes, I think again is more, the data's a lot more noisy. And there's a tendency, again, I'll talk about LLMs, all of these tools, they say, oh, well, we can process everything. There's a bit of a tendency to go, well, let's just save the world. Save down all the data that we have. We don't need to think now what data we will need, what attributes we will need. And then it makes usability a lot harder after. So I still think it's not necessarily what I would do differently. We've had to sort of clean up a lot in certain asset classes going backwards, but it is about, again, that conversation with the users of the data. What will you need? Okay, if you're not sure of the full use case, but still it has to be very considered. I think with even with LLMs, querying it, not necessarily going to, learning the Q language where you can be very specific about what you want to make sure the performance, is there and stays strong. I think we still have to be very careful about what we save down and that we know the use case and that we know it's sort of made performant or optimized for the use cases that we need. So yeah, it's just the consideration of what we're saving down that I think I would definitely sort of do better.
Yeah, you've described a pattern that's actually very common in the KDB customer base, in that many of our customers have the raw data dump in case they need it, but then they curate the data and load a curated data set into KDB for analysis. And one of the things I'm actually excited about with the KDBX open formats is that will actually make it way easier to go into the historical data dump in situ when you need some of that data and have the best of both worlds from your curated data set and your, I don't know what the terminology should be, your extra long storage, from your data dump of what's there. That way you never lose something in case you needed it, but you have options. But that does seem to be a very common pattern is, curated data versus a random universe of data can outperform in many cases.
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing. So exactly the solution you said is probably the right way, because I can't argue with maybe in 3 years' time you would want the data that you did not store down. And sometimes it's easy to backfill or get that historically. Sometimes it's not. And obviously the time that it's not, it's difficult to argue that you should not save down the world. But yeah, obviously, I mean, hopefully everybody knows the performance when you have exactly what you need in front of you is, completely changes the experience.
Well, let's talk a bit about the future. The part that's nearest and dearest to my heart, since I sit in product and that's what I deal with all day. So, you've learned a lot about what we're doing as our next generation of KDB, right? With KDBX, we have open formats, we have a multimodal database, we have a much more open platform, we have interoperability, all this great stuff. But what's most exciting to you? What do you think has the most potential for ING?
I think this processing of natural language or unstructured data with everything I've said just now. Because it was really interesting how quickly the world or technology has evolved. Because even if we're talking about, getting APIs to chat rooms, for example, to get broker data, it's seen, I would say, before maybe 2-3 years ago, 5-6 years ago, people who have that tool who start reading messages, they say, yeah, even the language has changed a little bit. Like people are speaking in more structured language because it can be read better. You know, if you're thinking of broker chats, how they price, the language has become simplified so that it can be read in. But it's almost like within 2 or 3 years, you just think I can, you know, write whatever format I want, and I'm always testing the limits of, you know, how natural the language can be. And I think, again, in our world, with where we're going with ING, not only is it you know, expanding the electronic trading capability across asset classes, but also bridging that gap between the voice and the electronic desks. So being able to, again, parse chats or use, you know, news data, all of these things, and especially with democratization of data, like we said, some traders use Q, but I mean, there's very few, right? Even if they can, it's quite simple. So the presentation that was shown before as well, just in terms of the power of being able to query our database and having the queue written by the LLM, I think is super powerful. So one, yes, getting the traders sales, and again, because they're looking at all these tools every day, they see the power of it now. There's not much convincing needed. I think some years ago, there was kind of even a bit of convincing needed in terms of what the data can do for you. I think that motivation is there now, and it's just giving them the tool to then dig in and get the sort of results they want. So I think that's going to be hugely powerful on the use of the data internally, sort of across functions. But separately to that, it is the unstructured data, being able to work with that, because I think that's in some sort of more complex products. I think there's a huge gap right now in terms of the e-trading capabilities, and this is the one thing that's going to close that gap, I think.
Yeah, actually, ironically, in the summit that we did in New York, one of the topics that was there was the big growth of alt data sets, and how those are sort of taking over as ways to find increased differentiation, given that the lifetime of alpha was shorter, and many of those alt data sets are essentially unstructured data.
Yes.
So it's a great opportunity to actually intermix that, whether you're trying to supercharge your research, you're trying to, you know, get better signals from reaction in the market. That, you know, I think that's very, it jives very well actually with the story that you just described and the opportunity that you see.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's really exciting.
Well, one of the key themes I think in the story though that you told was that there was this undercurrent of democratizing access to data, whether it was the visibility example that you gave, just how was that transformative for the business to see what was happening, whether it was the example of the traders that were accessing in Q, you just described in LLMs, sort of, you know, how can you make it easier for people to understand the data? So what do you think is that future of democratization? How do you think that's going to change the organization?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, there's such a long way to go still that I think giving access directly to sales or trading to the data, I think is what it's going to be. And then obviously with the agentic layer on top, in terms of showing whether it's what clients typically do, or if clients have done certain trades, you know, then to get the relevant data for them and maybe give some color back to them or trading ideas. I think that making that sort of process a lot more seamless than it is now, I think that will be a huge, win for us. And, you know, we talk about it like I know it's all doable, but it will take years to implement. So I'd rather get there before talking about the next sort of 10 or 20 years. But that for me is the sort of next biggest exciting step.
And that feature-based learning process that you described in that example of pricing models, how do you see that evolving? Will you change your different AI techniques? I know there's lots of things where people are looking at featureless training, like deep learning. There's a mass explosion of these different algorithms. You know, how do you think that'll change going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the other thing that I forgot to mention earlier as well, just in terms of experimentation. For us, I mean, we run a lean team, so it's about how much time to spend experimenting with these, even with LLMs. You know, people are looking at time series sort of forecasting forecasting, and we're experimenting with all of that. And it is just how much time you spend. But I think it's inevitable, right? I think it has to go in that direction. The models are getting much more complex. You know, you have to have that sort of extra edge, keep up with it. So it's definitely inevitable, and it's what we're sort of experimenting with right now, especially in certain markets like FX. I mean, it's just so fragmented. It's not a sort of very, you know, transparent market. It's an OTC market. Every player has a sort of different view of it. So you have to be a lot smarter with your models, and it's something that we're already exploring.
Well, thank you so much for sharing the journey you've been on, the impacts on your organization, how things have changed. Is there one kind of just key takeaway you want to leave the audience with as we wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, I would just go back to what I said before about the collaboration between business or the users of the data and the people building the data, because I think often there's a bit of a sort of disconnect, and I think that just makes the whole process a lot slower. So I think the more sort of business and the data team sort of collaborate, talk, and build it optimized for its use case, I think is by far the most powerful thing.
Fabulous. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your story. I appreciate it.
Thank you.